Okay. Good evening. I'm Terry Lohman. I'm the co-chair of Unitarian Universalists for a Just Economic Community with Sally Gellert. That's Sally G. She laughed when it came time for our Halloween event. She said, well, I'll wear my regular black box. So that's her Halloween costume still. It's lasting. Okay, Cindy went to COP27 in Egypt, and she'll have lots to say about it. I hope she just gives us the color and descriptions. You can't cover it all because it was way more than one person could cover. Thank you, Cindy.
Well, I'm really happy to have been with UUJEC for the last 3 years. I just find this group to be so amazing, and I love the work they do. We work for economic justice in accord with the Unitarian Universalist principles, so it's a very diverse amount of issues that we address and cover. We do lots of letters signing on and lots of events. I first met UUJEC members in 2019, some of them at the conference on the Green New Deal in Washington, D.C. So I've been able to participate since about then. And one thing I was so happy with UUJEC is because they took me, knowing that my focus that I really wanted to work on was stopping the DoD budget so that, can you hear me, Terry? Yeah, okay, yep. Good, okay, let's see. So stopping the DoD budget so that we would have money to address climate change. And so I'm still at it all these years later, and it seems like a little more possible. And I was at a meeting recently with Bruce Knotts, who used to be our UU at UN lead. And I had the opportunity then to ask him if he thought that UUs in general were ready yet to address the issue of cutting the Department of Defense's budget for climate. And he said yes. And I was very glad to hear that, because I've been waiting for that yes for 3 years. So that's what I'm looking forward to putting into the next AIW. The last AIW that I did, Code Red for Humanity, missed by 1 vote at GA. And I'm hoping any of you that are here that are unions, or if you're with VFP, you may know about it already. I did a resolution for Veterans for Peace on the same subject, but I'm hoping that we can pass it this year. So this is the UUJEC team. I just wanted to give a shout out to them because I have the greatest respect and love, really, for everybody on the board. Such dedicated, hardworking people. I mean, we seriously are a working group. If anybody in the group is a loafer, I guess it's me, because I'm always focused on my own little niche. But we accomplish a lot, we do a lot, and I really appreciate being a part of this group. So here we go. I really want to talk about why we need peace for climate justice in my COP27 report back. There's so many things that were going on COP. I mean, we could take it from any angle and we could talk for hours. So I can't really do that. I can only focus on one thing, and even that is going to take a lot of time. I don't know how long it'll take me to get through this talk, but I'll do the best that I can. There are a lot of corporate interests that were represented at COP. Of course, the fossil fuel industry was out in force. So the kind of injustices that we see every day at UUJEC were really manifold at COP. And it was rough. There was, at times, it was very rough. There were some 35,000 attendees from all over the world. And one of the most wonderful things that really isn't shown in this talk is the tremendous diversity of the people that were there. I was really shy to take their pictures. I didn't want to be intrusive, but it was amazing, just amazing. And the other thing amazing about it was the unity of spirit that we all had, that the majority of us were all there to work for mitigating and adapting to climate. So this is the group that I went with. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is one of the longest running women's peace groups in the world. It's been running more than 100 years. And I happened on to meeting them through my work with Veterans for Peace. And I feel very at home with this group in general. In order to make the money go further, we only had 10 seats. So 5 of us went the first week and 5 of us went the second week. And half of our group was from Africa. We also had Nuha from Lebanon, and she and I teamed up quite a bit. And then we had Michelle, a young woman, a young feminist from Germany, very dynamic woman, and Tamara, Canada, and me from the US, and also our lead, Catherine, who lives in the UK. She's staff at WILF. So we had a wonderful experience there in general. I did get help to stay this second week. Some of that came from Veterans for Peace. I got very sick while I was there, and I wasn't able to participate very well at all during that second week, which was very sad for me, but I had no choice. So one of WILF's goals is cutting the military budget for climate finance. And since I'd already been working on that for a few years before we got together, we were really a good fit. So the other things that they call for are disarmament, decarbonizing, demilitarizing, decolonizing, divestment, and defunding for feminist peace. Feminist peace just calls out the need for women to play a role as we go forward seeking these goals. And this, so the alignment that I have now of working with the UUJEC VFP Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, and also for WILF, has just been wonderful for me, because we're all very aligned. So this is a call out to the PCCMP. On the right of this picture, you see one of their banners in front of Washington, DC, militarism fuels the climate crisis. Our veterans have been getting arrested and to call attention to the climate crisis. And it's been working, and I'm very proud of them, and I'm hoping that we can do that together. And maybe some of our other members from the UU will join us. I probably will be getting myself arrested as well this year. So here we go. We're going to start going to COP. So I have this little video clip of us walking in. Thousands of people from around the world, all different languages, all different countries. But a great solidarity between us. So I'm going to move now to just a tiny little touch on the science. I wasn't sure who all would come, but I thought I should at least touch on the science. So the 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 degree Fahrenheit rise really isn't a goal. You hear us talking that we want to keep the rise of the temperature at 1.5 above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. That's the goal. But it's really more than a goal. It's a physical limit, because once we pass 1.5, we are at the risk of triggering tipping points that we won't be able to deal with as through human intervention anymore. We will be at the mercy of the climate. So the IPCC's sixth assessment report offered a dire warning to humanity and calls for urgent action. So the temperatures now is continuing to rise. And of course, the little picture there that I'm showing in this is from NASA during a time when we had so many fires across the planet. You can just see how horrendous that is. The majority of the heat coming in for climate change is actually going into the ocean. And based on millions of records, the World Meteorological Association has announced that the last 8 years have been the hottest on record. Most of that heat is being absorbed, as I said, by the oceans. So in the past 25 years, this is equivalent to something like 3.6 billion Hiroshima atom bomb explosions. So in terms of the impact on the climate, on the planet, we know that it's been deadly. And there's been a recent study released, Lancet did it, and also it's at Monash University. It's a Monash University study, but I think they did it in conjunction with Lancet. And they're telling us that there are 5 million deaths each year that are related to temperature of extreme heat or cold. We also know that in just 50 years, 1/3 of the Earth's population may need to survive in near unlivable Sahara Desert-like conditions. And if it's not too little water, it may well be the opposite with flooding and inundation. Climate change is not just a threat to our way of life, but it's a consequence of how we've been living. So when we talk about that, the issue of militarism has to come into play. The cost of War Project estimates that the military produced around 1.2 billion metric tons of CO2 emissions between 2001 and 2017, with nearly 1/3 of that coming from US wars overseas. One part of this that I think most of us tend to forget or don't know about, or is not brought up in our media very much, is that the truth of the matter is that the United States is a bit of an empire of vast proportions, really. I shouldn't say a bit of an empire. So our Joint Forces Command is all over the world, with the entire globe divided up into areas that under each control. And the global military emissions are estimated to be between 5 and 6% of the world's total emissions every year. But it's very little known and discussed, and neither is it reported to the UNFCCC. So despite the desperate need to reduce emissions, the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act has authorized giving the DoD $858 billion for the budget for the coming year. And the Department of Energy, which has responsibility for nuclear weapons that they share with the DoD, is budgeted separately. When we actually count those additional revenues in with DoD's budget, it's well over $1 trillion annually. This outrageous and unsustainable budget makes funding climate needs impossible and pushes the US population into serious debt, into austerity, while robotics, hypersonics, and the weaponization of space fill out the DoD wish list. I mean, it's time that we really start looking at what we're doing as a country and try to get control of our own national funding For one thing, the DoD budget has never passed an audit and was never even asked to do an audit, I don't think, before the last 5 years. Daniel Ellsberg tells us that in the face of imminent climate catastrophe, we must convert the military economy to a climate economy. We cannot have both. So I want to move now to just a little short clip of Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez as he opened the COP. I love this man.
In just days, our planet's population will cross a new threshold. The 8 billionth member of our human family will be born. This milestone puts into perspective what this climate conference is all about. How will we answer when baby 8 billion is old enough to ask, what did you do for our worlds and for our planet when you had the chance? Excellencies, this UN climate conference is a reminder that the answer is in our hands. And the clock is ticking. We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. The war in Ukraine, other conflicts have caused so much bloodshed and violence and their dramatic impacts all over the world.
Hi.
Uh-oh, I pushed the wrong thing.
Space.
Sorry.
We cannot accept that our attention is not focused on climate change. We must, of course, work together to support peace efforts and then the tremendous suffering. But climate change is on a different timeline and a different scale. It is a defining issue of our age. It is the central challenge of our century. It is unacceptable, outrageous, and self-defeating to put it on the back burner. Indeed, many of today's conflicts are linked with growing climate chaos. And the war in Ukraine has exposed the profound risks of our fossil fuel addiction. And today's crisis cannot be an excuse for backsliding or greenwashing. If anything, they are a reason for greater urgency, stronger action, and effective accountability.
So, despite Antonio Gutierrez's pleas for peace and climate justice, we saw that the DoD just got this $858 billion. And in addition to that, part of those monies have been earmarked for the Ukraine, continuing a trend that Colin Kahl, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, made clear last August that this was not for today's fight, but rather for years to come. And so my question is, why aren't we pushing the idea of negotiations and diplomacy and trying to end the war and end the bloodshed in Ukraine? Does our government or does our military have plans to make this a war that's a long-lasting war? I mean, we certainly don't want another war like what we went through in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just don't know what's ahead, but I think that we as citizens of the US should really be calling for diplomacy and negotiations. Inevitably, the war will have to end that way. So why don't we try to push that now? That's my question. So in this picture, on the one side, you see a picture of the Undersecretary of Defense, and also Justin Trudeau from Canada as he meets with the EU's Metsola. They met and agreed that they would do whatever they could to get weapon shipments to Ukraine. And we know that this has really changed the picture in Europe in terms of how much money and weapons are being produced for this war. And so I included this slide because I made this slide at the beginning of the war with Ukraine. Here John Kerry is calling out the connection. The longer the war in Ukraine carries on, the worse the consequences will be for the climate. So this was something that we were running into and addressing all the time while I was at COP. So as an aside, I also want to call this out, that we're running out of gas and oil completely. I mean, that little blue triangle down there at the bottom is our reserves for oil. We're supposed to be completely out of fossil fuel oils by 2051. That's coming right up. We're supposed to be out of gas by 2061. And by 2081, we're supposed to be out of coal. So this has been put on the back burner in terms of discussion. But so here we're being reminded by Omar Clay, environmental physicist. He tells us that the Earth only has 30 years of fossil fuels left, and how it is used and who makes those decisions is of utmost importance. So now an admission. When I tried to get in to see Antonio Gutierrez early the morning of him speaking at the plenary, I was denied access. My partner was also denied access. They were letting other people in, and we thought they were just letting in media. They wouldn't let us in. But I was able to find the media building and watch some of the plenaries from there. While I was there, I met Rami Almagari, and we just started talking, and it turned out that Rami is from Gaza. And I was shocked to think that somebody from Gaza was allowed out of the country to come to COP, to report on COP, and then go back to Gaza. But apparently he's been living that way for a long time. I gave him my Wilf handout. There's two sides to this. One was on the Code Red for Humanity on military emissions. It was an open note to John Kerry. And on the other side, we had a piece on the Green Climate Fund and also on loss and damages. And so I shared that along with VFP's pamphlets on militarism the whole time I was at COP, and it really helped open doors for me in talking with other delegates, especially other delegates, but other people as well. I also had a unique opportunity to speak with Al Gore. I didn't get much in. I just told him that he should have been our president. He told me he agreed as he was being hustled out by his bodyguards. But he gave another presentation at the plenary. And one of the things he told us was that at COP in Glasgow, world leaders agreed to phase out inefficient oil and gas subsidies. And that he himself was calling to end fossil fuel subsidies in the near term. He thought we could do it by the end of the year. Well, there's something like 51 different countries that have huge fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, they are huge, billions of dollars. So I'm hoping that this is one of the issues that the various groups that I work with can help push forward this year in support of what Al Gore is calling for, because it's definitely needed. So this is just a random picture. I'm going to show you some random pictures, just a very small handful of pictures that I took while I was at COP talking to people. This is two young Egyptian delegates, vibrant, full of life, full of hope. I gave them my literature and it was just fun. And on the left, what you see there is the buses. They had a tremendous bus system that covered a wide area in Sharm el Sheikh, so we could get where we were trying to go. And then I had slipped this into another call out to my dear comrades at VFP. So one of the things that I did at COP that I was very happy to have been able to do was to speak to the US State Department. The US State Department held a special meeting that was just for US delegates to COP, and the room was just packed. Some of these people I have spoken to online, but I hadn't met in person. Some I didn't know. I did try to engage with them, although I didn't have a lot of time ahead of COP. So it was a good meeting. I was lucky they called on me first to raise my question. And of course, I talked about the need to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, and that if we were to do that, all emissions had to be tracked, that under the US government, under the Clinton administration, the IPC was pressured. I'm not saying this is from Clinton himself at all, but to exclude military emissions from being reported. And they were granted confidentiality. In fact, they were granted such a confidentiality that to this day, those emissions are not discernible, even when they are reported, because they are mixed in with civilian emissions. And so the public, they're shielded from public scrutiny. So this is just really devastating, knowing how many emissions we actually have and how impactful they must be to the climate. So I was calling for these emissions to be included in our nationally determined contributions, reported to the UNFCCC annually, and also calling for an update in how the protocols are arranged at the UNFCCC and IPCC so that they can be scrutinized. While I was there at that meeting with the US State Department, I was fortunate to run into Ahti Tolvanen, who is a UU from Canada. And he came up and introduced himself, told me that he had wanted to bring that issue up himself, but he was glad that I did it. And I was just thrilled because I had been trying to get a hold of him something like 1.5 years or 2 years ago, so that we would collaborate, maybe build some ties with the Canadian UUs, but I hadn't been able to. But so we just had a lovely chat, and he was such a lovely person. While we were talking, some other folks that I had gotten acquainted with from Nigeria came up, and so we took a picture of all of us together. These two individuals, Falmata Bulama and her son, came to COP. He works with the United Nations, and he also works with an organization called CARE. And he gave me his card, and we've been in touch with one another. I just was really taken by his mother. She doesn't speak English, and I don't speak her language, but you can see we had a bond. It was lovely. And the way that the WILF women started our day typically was at the Women and Gender Constituency. So every morning at 8 o'clock, we were there, or a little after 8, because the buses didn't always get us there on time. And it was a great opportunity to mix with people and get to know them and hear their stories. And the Women and Gender Constituency is actually part of the UN. So it's a fabulous group. You know, I see that I'm talking too much, so I'll try to speed it up a little bit. The young feminist sometimes did events for us, and they sang and danced and provided a little bit of relief from some of the heaviness that was going on at COP. One of the other women that I met there and passed out my material to and exchanged business cards with was Constance Ocalet. And we didn't really have a chance to discuss what her life was like when we did that. It was just a short encounter. But when I got home, I looked up who she was, and it was amazing. For the first time in her life and past generations, their area was hit by an extreme flood that wiped out their entire community, their homes, their livestock, their gardens. She was the mother of 7 children she was feeding by raising a garden just using a hoe. So all of that was wiped out. They had to leave. They came back, and then they were hit by a second flood. They came back again. Her house survived, one of the few, and some 30 people moved into her home. All of her neighbors moved in with her. And then they had a 6-month drought. And during that drought, there was a tremendous amount of death of their livestock and of their people, their elderly, their children. There was malaria, but other diseases that were spread because the sanitation system was completely destroyed by the waters, and everything was devastating. So out of that, they formed a wonderful kind of a union, and they've been working together to educate people about climate all the years since then. The most terrible thing about her story, though, is just how common that kind of story is when you listen to what the women from Africa have to say. Today, more than half of the world's women and children are living in areas that are being hit either by climate or by conflict or by both. And this is extremely detrimental to them. The life expectancy of women in conflict areas, particularly women who are pregnant, is short. Some of these women have to walk, 3 hours each way, or I should say, I don't know how, it may be longer on the way back carrying that load to get water, and they're subjected to rapes and all kinds of sexual abuse in that process. So the stories coming out of Africa were really heartrending and had an impact on my life. I don't want to complain about little things that happen to me in my life anymore. I mean, we don't really deserve to, and this is what's going on. And these people didn't contribute to climate change. The United States is the world's largest cumulative producer of emissions. So I'm going to move quickly now here through some of the slides. I'm trying to move quickly. Just wonderful people there. I was fortunate to run into Tom Goldtooth. He's somebody I met through VFP and getting the John Kerry letter signed. And I've been in contact with him intermittently from time to time. And we had planned to meet up at COP. I didn't really have time to meet with him and his contingency, but we did meet just momentarily. And off to the right, what you see is a slide from the Indigenous Pavilion. The Indigenous people at COP were very discouraged at the outcome of COP. Amy Goodman interviewed Tom. He's a long time standby at COP. He's been going for years. I wasn't always able to speak with people. These young Juman students were there. We couldn't talk, but the language of the heart was clear. Ellie Kinney was there from CEOBS. We took time to meet up for dinner one night. That was lovely. And on the right is a picture of an unknown gentleman who just came up and asked me to have my picture taken with him. In this picture here is a young woman in her early 20s from China. I was so shocked to learn that there was somebody there from China. And she told me the work that she's doing in some remote villages of China to try to help to move them towards a green, sustainable lifestyle. I don't really have slides in here about the different side events very much because I just didn't have room. But there were side events on every kind of topic you can imagine. I also spent some time in the green zone. The green zone was very desolate. It was mostly businesses. There was nobody there. I mean, I walked all around. I swear to you, there were more security there than there were visitors in the area that I saw. I did find one event. This was an event put on by Egyptians talking about their own efforts to move Egypt closer to sustainable goals. And a lot of young people there, and they invited me to have my picture taken with them. So I joined them, but I really didn't see Westerners at this event. So this is a slide I took from in front of the US Pavilion. Joe Biden was expected later the day I took this, and he's calling out the US efforts to confront the climate crisis. I was sitting at the feet of these individuals, which is Senator Ben Cardin, Senator Ed Markey, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. I mean, the room was packed, and I was lucky to get in at all, but I squeezed myself in right at their feet, and I filmed most of it on my iPhone. What they were talking about essentially was the Inflation Reduction Act. And I mean, they were beaming. They were so happy that they had gotten this through. So they had a huge sense of accomplishment about it, considering the highs and lows and the length of time that that went on. Senator Markey talked about how frustrated they've been that they didn't have money. He said it was blocked by the Republican constituency in terms of getting money to support the Green Fund, and that they were hoping to move forward with that now. But, you know, there was some frustration for me in the talk, particularly when Senator Whitehouse started talking about the impacts of climate on the military. And there was not a word from anyone about how the military impacted the climate. So I really wanted to get to Q&A to address that, but they rushed out of there before I was able to do that. One of the Wilf women, Tamara from Canada, rushed up and did a code pink number on the stage about everything that the US had done to further climate change. And she was accurate in what she said. She was rapid fire speaking. She's been at several COPs. She really knew her way around. And I did also join her. I went up there and I talked about my thing, which is the military emissions. I'm not sure that was very welcomed, and it probably put me on a blacklist for getting in to see Kerry or Biden, but you know, that's what I did. This is just calling out my concern that none of our representatives made any mention of the military impacts on climate itself. So then Biden came later that night. They blocked off the roads for his visit, all kinds of security out. He again talked a lot about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and all kinds of moves that the United States has made towards reducing our emissions. It was a good long talk. He got a standing O. People paid tremendous attention to what he did talk about. One thing that I was happy with Biden about was the efforts of the US government and the US State Department to begin to make some amends with China in terms of addressing climate. I was also happy with the president for the work done on methane. I learned a lot about methane. He mentioned something in his talk that I thought it was a mistake, and I looked it up, and it was some new research that's been done, that it's not, we have always known that methane was 80 times more potent than CO2, but we didn't understand how prevalent it was. So there's been new studies now. NASA's been able to do some new studies that shows that methane is having a much bigger impact on the climate than we knew. So I learned that from President Biden. And I'm glad for the efforts that went forward at COP. We've got 130 nations signing on to a pledge to reduce methane. It's been going on for 2 or 3 years, but the number was upped. I wasn't really thrilled with everything that our president had to say. My thought is that blaming blaming Russia completely for inflation and the cost of food prices is really misleading, because we know that on our southern border, we have people here that are coming because they can't eat because of climate change. So to say that it's all being pushed by Russia, I didn't feel comfortable with that. So this is John Kerry at COP with his equivalent leader in China. They didn't really say much of anything about what they were going to do, but just reaffirming some joint work is meaningful. This is the Ukraine Pavilion. The way I have this picture, you can't really see in the background there behind Kerry as he walks through the Ukraine Pavilion, but the Ukraine Pavilion was just packed all the time. It was a very stark setting, very sobering, and very, very little room in there. We were crammed in there like you would not believe. It was terribly uncomfortable. I didn't get to see everything that was important that happened in Ukraine. I just stayed for this one event where they were talking about the military impacts on the environment in Ukraine, which I was already pretty aware of, but it was something that a lot of people at COP were making sure that they dropped in on. We also had a Zoom presentation from NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and I was within 7 minutes. He was introduced by the chairman of Munich Security, Christoph Hughes, and he talked in less than 7 minutes. He laid out the links between climate change and security. He said that's what NATO was interested in, and that was climate change as a crisis multiplier. No surprise. NATO was interested in adapting military operations and missions for extreme weather. They have to harden their gear to work in the Arctic and wherever they're going to be. And then number 3, reduce military emissions, starting by mapping these emissions better than we do today. And that was it. So for me, I was very, very disappointed. Stoltenberg had come out after COP26 saying that there was no way we could reach keep the level at 1.5 without addressing military emissions, but he was never forthcoming on how they were going to do it. And he certainly wasn't forthcoming later. He did go on to say that, they wanted to be part of the technological revolution, and they had a goal of cutting emissions from NATO bodies and commands by 45% by 2030. But mostly he went on to talk about the war in the Ukraine and Russia's role in that, which we know is changing the face of Europe, as all NATO members are called to give 2% of their gross domestic product to the military. And Germany has upped its military commitment to $100 billion, and that NATO has reaffirmed its nuclear alliance. While the governments are uniformly aligning themselves with NATO, a lot of the women that I have met from Europe and WILF are very, very opposed to it because of the same reasons that I'm talking to you here. Greater austerity for their populations, and the impacts of a war environment. So I made this slide from shots from Ukraine, and we are well aware that there are tremendous environmental impacts there from that war, as well as the death and destruction and tremendous suffering of those people. All the more reason for negotiations and peace and ending the war. I'm again calling out what Secretary Antonio Gutierrez said about we are on the road to climate hell. This is the fight of our lives, and we're fast approaching the tipping points. So the highlight for me at COP was this side event. Tipping point north-south with Deborah Burton. So the VFP people may be well aware of Deborah. Tipping Point North-South works with CEOBS and Transnational Institute. They're doing wonderful work on getting military emissions counted and calling for reporting. I took these slides from Axel Mikalova's talk. I'm not sure, Mikalova, I'm not sure I'm saying his name correctly. He presented along with Deborah Burton, and I didn't really have time. I just finished writing this talk 20 minutes before I was supposed to be on. Anyway, he calls for many of the same things that I was calling for in our AIW and our VFP resolution, but they've refined it, and I really like some of the things that he's calling for. He's calling for the emissions to be part of a global stock take. It's a new thing that's coming up. Inclusion in the national inventory guidelines under the IPCC, which is something I didn't think about. And something that I didn't think about was including military emissions in a section on the 7th IPCC's assessment report. I don't think that IPCC is going to do that. I think they've heard back, but they did write a letter to that effect, and I'm really hoping that it moves forward that way. I was calling that also for military war emissions to be included, and he didn't mention that. So I intend to get in touch with them and see if that was something that they would also include in secondary emissions from the military. But he does call that aggressors should be made responsible for these emissions through the peace settlements. So that was interesting. I just love Deborah. I absolutely adore her. I got to spend a little time with her at a special coffee shop that you couldn't get into unless you were civil society delegates to COP. So it was very nice, no security around because the area was very, very securitized. Anyway, she says, you know, in the next 7 years, we have to get to 45% reduction by 2030. And during that time, we'll spend 15 trillion on our militaries. So we need to think about what the hell we're doing as a species. We're moving in completely the wrong direction. Nick Buxton, who is with the Transnational Institute, did not come to COP. He's been at this work for years and years. Amy Goodman also interviewed him following or during COP, and the 2.1 trillion that the global military spends, he says, is diverting money from fighting climate change. No surprise there. So I'm going to start wrapping up a little bit now. The biggest failure at COP was the omission of phasing out fossil fuels. I mean, this was a huge blow. For me personally, I wasn't expecting any miracles, but it was a huge blow. I wanted to know what happened and who was responsible. And this is what I learned. It appears that there were valiant efforts by a number of nations, at least 80, I know, to strengthen the language during the final hours, in the late hours of the night. They were there. but there was pushback from Alok Sharma, the Egyptian president of the COP27, to not deny any such movement. And this comes to us from Lawrence Tubiana, who was the main architect of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So that's what she tweeted. I found her tweet. And then I brought James Shaw into this, and I've emailed him, but I don't expect any response. He's an MP from New Zealand, and he said this: there was very strong movement by some of the petrostates to try and unwind some of the decisions to go back to the pre-Paris agreements. And so, as you can tell, because of how late we were, there was a trench warfare in that many countries wanted the targets to be much stronger. Trench warfare, I mean, both sides not going to give an inch, but the power went to the COP president to make that determination. So then Lawrence also tells us that the influence of the fossil fuel industry was found across the board. I think there was something like 630, something like that, fossil fuel representatives at this COP. Last year it was 400 and some. There was also 1,000 delegates. I think from United Emirates were there. It could be Saudi Arabia, but I think it was UAE. And the scant reference to science, the 1.5 Celsius and weak nationally determined language show this too. The trend cannot continue in the United Arab Emirates next year at COP28. So I have here a little slide about loss and damages, because that was a high note, a really high note for a lot of the African nations. What loss and damages actually is it's there after a 30-year push to move forward on paying for the damage that they've already endured, what they're going through now. It's not about mitigation. It's not about adaptation. It's about, fixing what they have already lost. It was a huge deal. Another high point here that I just love, Mia Motley, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, tells us that the world is facing increased cost of living because of the war in Ukraine, the COVID pandemic, debt crises in the developing countries, and climate crisis. So this woman, and I suppose she had collaborators, put something called the Bridgetown document together, saying that they were calling for no more predatory lending. This is also something that Al Gore called out when he spoke. He really called out the US World Bank for their role in charging the poor African nations multiples of what they charge other nations and trying to get any lending. And this has been so successful. You might write down Bridgetown document and look it up. I mean, this is wonderful. It's actually getting tremendous support to change our whole financial system in terms of these practices. Then I got a question. Terry sent me a question that someone who was planning to come to the talk tonight wanted to know ahead of time. So I put it in here. And he said, please explain why Greta Thunberg feels that COP would be greenwashing instead of a forum for requiring significant steps to halt and reverse global warming. And what can civil society do? So she didn't show up. And this is a question for a lot of activists. Naomi Klein didn't show up either, and for good reason. Greta was right about COP not delivering on what was most necessary. That is really reducing fossil fuels. At the last minute, after all of this talk about how wonderful and concerned everybody is about fossil fuels, a handful of nations, I've been told by two very highly placed sources, that the number of nations that held that back was very few. So Greta's saying, she's supporting being in the street. She's supporting alternative action going forward. At the same time, Lawrence Tubiana is calling for us to go back to COP. She says, let's look beyond COP. COP could be pivotal, COP27, or it should be the 28. I put the wrong number here. The world also broke the taboo against our broken financial system. There is momentum behind the push to restructure the World Bank and the Monetary Fund to meaningfully support the most vulnerable and rapid ramp up of renewables. So she is holding out hope. She says the calls to phase out fossil fuels are more ardent, broad, and deafening than ever. And we are up against a huge adversary, but we have momentum. COP27 showed multilateralism works, but it needs national pressure everywhere. We are all activists today. So it comes down to us, what we want to do. I imagine some of us will continue to support COP. Some of us will continue to say, hey, you know, that's a lot of money to go. And there's a lot of problems at COP. And maybe our time, energy, and finances might be better spent fighting this battle another way. So those decisions will be made by civil society over the next year. So this is Tatiana's, what she's telling us, look beyond COP. 2023 could be pivotal. The world broke the taboo around our broken international finance system, thanks to the wonderful leader of Barbados. There is momentum behind the push to restructure the World Bank and the IMF to meet climate needs. We can do this. And I think that there is some discussion going on within the UU, maybe at the higher levels of starting to take on the concept of civil disobedience. So I'm hoping that in the year to come that maybe UUs and civil society can join in on this effort and call attention. I think it's been very valuable what Veterans for Peace has done in this regard. And that center picture there is actually Susan, who is our exiting leader at UU, at the UUA. This is her being arrested in a migration, immigration issue years ago. So many UUs also have a history of being willing to practice civil disobedience. We can do this because we must do this. We absolutely must do this. We have a very limited time, and we have to do this. It's a mountain that's steep to climb, but it's got to be done. And with justice, equity, and compassion, while there is still time. For those of you who aren't UU members, this is our symbol of the UU faith. So we need to end fossil fuel subsidies. We need to cut the DoD budget. We need diplomacy and negotiations. We must end the war in Ukraine. We can't give up the fight, and peace for climate justice. Thank you all. I appreciate your joining us.
Thanks, Cindy. Okay.
How do
Are
I
you
get
going to stop the share?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm sure somebody will have
I'll stop
questions.
sharing. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for sitting through that. I know it was a really, really long talk, but you know, I'm just one of millions of people around the world that are so burdened by this. I mean, we are truly burdened, and we feel it so strongly. And I know that all of you that are here are carrying a burden for what future generations will experience, and also for what people around the world are experiencing right now. So if anybody has any questions, I have limited answers, but I'll do my best. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your coming and sharing your time with me as I make this presentation. And it was good to see members from VFP here too. Thank you. Love, peace.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.